6 months ago, my neighbors called my dog a menace. Then the HOA passed a rule aimed only at me. I stayed quiet, paid every fine, smiled at every meeting, but I was already planning something they never saw coming. The board president thought she controlled the whole neighborhood. She didn't know I still had the security footage. By the night of the gala, she was sweating. What walked through those doors changed everything. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I live on Larkspur Lane with my husband Danny and our beagle mix, Biscuit, in a subdivision called Pine Hollow Ridge. We bought our house 4 years ago, our first real home, and Biscuit came with us from the very beginning. Life on Larkspur Lane was ordinary in the best way: barbecues, kids on bikes, the hum of lawnmowers on Saturdays. I worked from home doing bookkeeping for a local dental office, and most afternoons I walked Biscuit past the clubhouse, waving at neighbors who mostly waved back. The trouble started when Deborah Voss became HOA president. Debbie had lived in Pine Hollow longer than anyone, and she ran the board like it was a small kingdom, not a volunteer committee. She smiled at the welcome barbecues but kept a clipboard of grievances tucked under one arm. Debbie's house sat 2 doors down from mine, a beige colonial with a flag that changed for every holiday. She noticed things: a trash can left out an hour too long, a car parked at the wrong angle. Neighbors joked about her, quietly, behind closed doors. I first got on her radar the week Biscuit dug up a strip of mulch near the mailbox cluster. She left a typed note in my box. Not a phone call, not a knock, a note, cold and formal, citing a rule number I didn't know existed. I apologized anyway, fixed the mulch myself that weekend, and thought that was the end of it. Debbie waved at me from her porch the next morning like nothing had happened, which should have told me something about how she operated. Danny said I was overthinking it. She's like that with everyone, he told me, and for a while it seemed true.
I What's her skulle teenager for skateboarding.
A widow for wind chimes, a young couple for their above-ground pool. But there was a pattern underneath the pettiness. The people Debbie targeted hardest were the ones who'd crossed her once, questioned a budget line, voted against her at a meeting, or simply refused to defer when she raised her voice. I had done exactly that 8 months earlier. At the annual meeting, when I asked why the landscaping contract had tripled in price. Debbie's answer was vague. Pressed. Object. I didn't think much of it until later, because the landscaping company, turned out, was owned by Debbie's brother-in-law. I didn't know that yet. My smile had gone thin and tight when I asked my question, and she hadn't forgotten it. Biscuit, meanwhile, was a good dog with one flaw: separation anxiety that made him howl, briefly, whenever Danny and I both left the house at once. It happened maybe twice a week, for no more than 10 minutes, and most neighbors never noticed, except Debbie noticed everything. She started a folder, I learned this later, labeled simply noise complaints, Larkspur Lane. My name was the only one written inside it, even before any other resident had filed a single complaint against me. In March, a new HOA newsletter arrived with an amendment buried on page 4. A quiet community standards policy limiting pet noise to under 30 seconds, unenforced for 11 years, suddenly revived with unanimous board approval and an effective date 2 weeks out. I read it twice, laughed, and told Danny it had to be a joke. 30 seconds. Whirl lasted longer than that. Danny wasn't laughing. He'd already noticed whose name appeared as the amendment sponsor, Deborah Voss. At the next open meeting, I raised my hand and asked why this specific rule, at this specific time, with this specific number. Debbie answered smoothly that the board had received multiple complaints, though she never named a single complainant or produced a single record. A woman near the back, Carol Ibsen, quiet, always knitting during meetings, caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, like she knew something and wasn't ready to say it yet. I filed that look away for later. 2 days after the meeting, an official warning letter arrived, citing Biscuit for excessive vocalization on a date I could prove Danny and I were both home the entire evening. It didn't matter. Attached. $75. I called the HOA management office and asked how a complaint could be filed against a dog that hadn't barked. The property manager, a tired man named Greg who clearly wanted no part of Debbie's crusades, sighed and said, "The president submitted it herself. That was twist number 1. Though I didn't call it that yet. Debbie wasn't relaying neighbor complaints. She was generating them. I paid the fine because Danny said fighting it would only paint a target on our backs. And for now, I agreed. Word moved fast on Larkspur Lane. Within a week, 3 other pet owners received near-identical letters. The Hendersons' Beagle, the Patel's Terrier, a rescue pit bull belonging to a young Army veteran named Marcus who'd just moved in that spring. The Patels, an older couple who'd lived on Larkspur Lane longer than almost anyone, told me their terrier had received a fine for a single bark caught on a neighbor's video doorbell. Footage Debbie had somehow obtained and forwarded to the board without ever asking the neighbor's permission first. Mrs., usually soft-spoken at meetings, admitted privately that she suspected Debbie had been collecting doorbell footage from sympathetic residents for months, quietly building a surveillance network under the guise of community safety, long before any of us realized what it was actually being used for. What those 4 households had in common wasn't loud pets. It was that all 4 of us had, at one point, disagreed publicly with Debbie about the landscaping contract, about a fence variance, about a pool rule she'd tried to push through unilaterally. Marcus told me over the fence one evening that Debbie had shown up unannounced at his door the week he moved in, informing him his dog wasn't the right fit for the neighborhood's image. He hadn't reported it. He hadn't wanted trouble. By April, the fines had become routine, arriving with the predictability of a utility bill. I started keeping a folder of my own, printing every letter, timestamping every walk, building a record I didn't yet know I'd need. Debbie escalated at the May meeting, proposing a compliance escrow, a deposit homeowners with pets would have to pay up front, refundable only after a full year of zero noise violations. It targeted 4 households by definition, and everyone in the room knew which 4. I stood up and asked, calmly, whether singling out specific breeds or specific families was legal under the HOA's own bylaws. Debbie's face flushed. "We're not singling anyone out," she snapped. Too fast. Too defensive. And the room went very quiet. Carol Ibsen finally spoke, gently pointing out that the bylaws required board proposals to be reviewed by the full committee before a vote, not just rubber-stamped by the president. Debbie glared at her the way you'd glare at a betrayal. The escrow proposal failed by 1 vote that night, Carol's, and I caught, for the first time, a flicker of real fear crossed Debbie's face. Losing a vote wasn't just an inconvenience to her. It was a threat to something bigger. I didn't understand what that something was yet, but I noticed Debbie corner Todd Reyes, Another board member, in the parking lot afterward, her voice low and sharp, his posture stiff and apologetic, nodding along like a man being reminded of a debt. 2 days later, Todd changed his public stance entirely, posting in the neighborhood app that he now fully supported pet compliance measures. I filed that away too. Something was keeping people in line that had nothing to do with barking dogs. The Hendersons, exhausted by fines, gave their beagle to a cousin 2 towns over. I watched Mrs. Way the day the dog left, and something in me hardened. This wasn't about noise. This was about who got to belong here. Marcus, the veteran, told me privately that his therapist had recommended the dog specifically, a trained companion animal for PTSD, though it wasn't registered as a formal service animal yet. Debbie knew this. Twice, in 1 month. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as an annoying neighbor and started thinking of it as a pattern worth documenting properly. Methodically, the way you'd build a case rather than just survive a bad season. I started attending every meeting, recording audio openly with permission, cross-referencing dates on Debbie's complaint letters against my own phone's GPS and step data, which placed me at the grocery store during 2 violations she'd logged against Biscuit. In June, Debbie tried something bolder, a letter threatening further action, up to and including removal of non-compliant animals, a phrase with no basis in the actual bylaws, which capped penalties strictly at monetary fines and never mentioned confiscation. I called a lawyer friend, a woman named Priya from my college days, who read the letter and laughed grimly. "This isn't enforceable," she said. "But that doesn't mean she won't try it anyway. People like this rely on you not checking." Priya helped me draft a formal records request, citing the HOA's own governing documents, demanding every noise complaint filed against Larkspur Lane residents for the past 2 years, including the name of each original complainant, not just Debbie's summaries. Greg, the property manager, took 2 full weeks to respond, and when he finally did, the numbers were staggering. Of 41 total complaints filed since Debbie took office, 38 had been submitted by D. Voss directly, not by any neighbor at all. I sat with that number for a long time. 38 out of 41. This wasn't a woman responding to a noisy neighborhood. This was a woman inventing a crisis. Alone, meticulously, letter by letter, fine by fine, for reasons I still didn't fully understand. Priya read the number back to me over the phone twice, like she wanted to make sure she'd heard it right. 38 self-filed complaints and 0 from actual neighbors, she said. That's not enforcement. That's a one-woman campaign wearing an HOA badge. I asked Greg, gently, whether he'd ever questioned the volume of complaints coming from a single source before approving fines. He admitted he hadn't. Debbie handled resident relations personally, and the board had simply trusted her summaries without ever double-checking the underlying paperwork. That admission bothered me more than anything Debbie had done directly. An entire enforcement system had run on nothing but her word for years, unquestioned, because questioning the HOA president felt, to most people, like more trouble than it was worth. I decided to hold what I'd found and wait, gathering more before confronting anyone, because I'd learned by now that Debbie always had a countermove ready the moment you challenged her directly. For a few weeks, an uneasy calm settled over Larkspur Lane. No new letters arrived. Debbie even complimented my garden at a block party. a strange, glassy smile on her face, like a storm pretending to be sunshine. Danny thought maybe she'd backed off after the failed escrow vote. I didn't believe it. Are idling near our house at odd hours. Slow drive-bys timed suspiciously close to whenever Biscuit and I left for a walk. Marcus mentioned the same thing. Debbie parked across from his driveway twice that week. Doing nothing. Just watching. The way you'd watch prey you were deciding how to take down without leaving fingerprints on the wound. Carol Ibsen invited me for coffee. Finally ready to talk. She told me she'd served on the board with Debbie for 6 years, and that this pattern, targeting whoever challenged her, then escalating quietly, had happened at least twice before her. One family, the Okafors, had moved out entirely 3 years earlier after a nearly identical campaign over a supposedly unauthorized fence. Debbie's husband, turned out, had made an offer on their house within a month of their departure. Below market, uncontested. That detail lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. This wasn't random cruelty. There was a pattern of pressure, departure, and quiet profit. And Carol suspected, though she couldn't yet prove it, that Debbie had done this before I ever moved in. The quiet ended in July, when Debbie filed a formal complaint with animal control claiming Biscuit had menaced a child near the community pool. An incident I could prove never happened, since Biscuit and I were 40 miles away at my sister's house that entire weekend. Carol added that the Okafors hadn't been alone. An earlier family, before her own time on the board, had also left abruptly under murky circumstances, though records from that period were incomplete, as if certain files had simply never made it into the HOA's official archive. The thought of a slow, repeating cycle stretching back years, each family absorbing the pressure alone, never comparing notes, never realizing they were living through the same manufactured crisis, made the whole situation feel less like a personal grudge and more like a quiet, ongoing operation. An animal control officer named Deputy Alvarez showed up at my door regardless, apologetic but obligated to follow protocol, explaining that a formal written complaint had triggered a mandatory home visit regardless of how implausible it sounded to him personally. I showed Alvarez my phone's location history, gas station receipts, even a photo my sister had posted online showing Biscuit at her lake house on the exact date in question. He shook his head, clearly frustrated. This happens a lot with this HOA, he admitted. That admission was twist number 2. Debbie had filed false reports with outside agencies before, enough times that a county officer recognized the pattern instantly. Enough times that he quietly gave me his card and told me to keep documenting everything. Debbie's false report cost her nothing personally, but it cost me an afternoon, a spike of adrenaline, and a new, colder understanding. She wasn't just petty anymore. She was willing to lie to a government agency to manufacture a case against my family. I called Priya again. This report to animal control could constitute a form of harassment, potentially actionable, and suggested I start keeping a formal harassment log with dates, times, and witnesses for every single incident going forward. Marcus, hearing what happened to me, admitted Debbie had done something similar to him, an anonymous tip to his landlord's insurance company questioning whether his dog was a dangerous breed, despite the dog's clean bill of health and obedience certification. We started comparing notes like survivors of the same storm, and a strange, unexpected camaraderie formed among the 4 originally targeted households. A quiet resistance meeting weekly over coffee that Debbie had no idea existed right under her nose. At the July board meeting, Debbie proposed banning unregistered emotional support animals from common areas entirely, a rule aimed squarely at Marcus, whose paperwork was still pending through the VA's slow bureaucratic process. This time, I came prepared. I stood, read aloud the actual ADA and fair housing guidelines regarding assistance animals, and watched Debbie's confident expression falter as several other residents, hearing the legal exposure for the HOA itself, began murmuring in concern. The proposal died on the spot, tabled indefinitely, and Debbie adjourned the meeting 10 minutes early, her voice tight, her hands gripping the gavel harder than necessary. I felt, for the first time, something like the ground shifting beneath her. But victory made her more dangerous, not less. 2 nights later, someone left our side gate unlatched while Danny and I were both at work, and Biscuit got loose, running 4 blocks before a kind stranger caught him near the elementary school. The gate had a child-proof latch that required deliberate effort to open, not something the wind or a loose hinge could manage alone. Our home security camera, angled toward the driveway, had captured a partial figure near the fence line at 7:40 that morning. The footage was blurry, just a shoulder and the edge of a familiar beige cardigan. Not enough for police to act on, but more than enough for me to feel a cold certainty settle in my stomach about who had been in my yard. I didn't confront Debbie. Instead, I quietly upgraded my camera system, added motion-triggered recording to the side yard specifically, and started saving every clip to a cloud drive Priya helped me set up, safe from anyone who might try to delete it later. Marcus offered to install a second angle for me, a habit from his years in the military he called redundancy, and within a week I had 3 overlapping views of my property, all backed up automatically, none of them accessible from inside my own house alone. Carol, meanwhile, told me she'd started her own quiet records too. Screenshots of Debbie's texts to the board group chat, several of which had grown increasingly unhinged, referencing handling the noise problem permanently and making examples of non-compliant families. I asked Carol why she hadn't reported any of this to the county HOA oversight board years ago. She looked at her hands and said simply, "Because the last person who tried got sued for defamation, and Debbie's brother is a lawyer." I asked Carol whether anyone had ever simply told Debbie no and stood firm without backing down. She thought about it for a long moment before admitting that, as far as she knew in 6 years, absolutely no one ever had. Not once. Not fully. That answer stayed with me for days. Debbie's entire method depended on people folding before things got serious. A fine paid quietly, a complaint withdrawn, a family choosing to move rather than fight. I decided, right there, I wasn't going to be the exception that folded too. That detail explained a great deal. Why Todd folded so fast in the parking lot. Why Carol had waited years to speak up. Why an entire neighborhood had quietly absorbed years of Debbie's overreach rather than risk a costly legal fight. Debbie's brother, Richard Voss, wasn't just any lawyer. He specialized in HOA litigation, representing boards against homeowners, and had a reputation, Carol said, for drowning ordinary families in legal fees until they simply gave up out of exhaustion. I felt the shape of the trap now. Debbie didn't need to win arguments. She only needed to make resistance expensive enough that reasonable people quit before the truth ever surfaced. It had worked on this neighborhood for years. Quietly, efficiently, but I wasn't the Okafors, forced out with nowhere else to go. I had Priya offering free counsel out of loyalty, a folder of documented lies, 3 camera angles, a county officer sympathetic to my case, and 3 other families willing to testify. Debbie, sensing resistance stiffening rather than breaking, shifted tactics again in August, calling an emergency board meeting to propose the harshest measure yet. Mandatory pet removal for any household accumulating more than 3 violations within a calendar year. I had exactly 3 violations logged against Biscuit. Every single one of them fabricated. Every single one of them now backed by documented proof of impossibility. Debbie was, without realizing it, building the very rope she would eventually hang herself with. At that meeting, I said nothing during the debate, letting Marcus and the Hendersons' remaining allies argue the practical objections while I quietly recorded everything, waiting for the right moment, a moment I could feel approaching but hadn't yet arrived. The removal proposal passed by a narrow 3-2 vote. Todd caving again under whatever pressure Debbie held over him. And I walked out of that meeting with a strange calm instead of panic, because now the threat had a deadline. And deadlines meant leverage. Debbie's new rule gave households 30 days to reach compliance before removal proceedings began. A phrase with no legal teeth whatsoever but enough psychological weight to have already convinced 2 more pet-owning families in the neighborhood to consider moving. I used those 30 days differently than Debbie expected. Instead of hiding, I filed my full harassment log, the false animal control report, the escrow proposal, the unlatched gate footage, Carol's screenshots with the county's HOA oversight division, and requested a formal review. Marcus asked if I was worried about retaliation once Debbie learned about the county filing. I told him I was, honestly, but that staying quiet hadn't protected anyone so far. Not the Hendersons, not the Okafors before them, not even Biscuit, who'd done nothing wrong at all. Danny installed a second deadbolt that same week. Not because I asked him to, but because he'd started reading through the harassment log himself in the evenings and no longer thought of any of this as merely annoying. He was, I realized, as unsettled as I was. The county division, I quickly learned, moved slower than a glacier, and I understood the review process alone could take months. Well past Debbie's 30-day deadline, which meant I needed a faster form of leverage if I wanted to protect Biscuit in the meantime. Priya suggested something clever: request, formally and in writing, the original complainant records for all 38 self-filed complaints, citing a transparency clause buried in Article 9 of the HOA's own governing documents. One Debbie herself had never bothered to actually read. Greg, the property manager, forwarded my request up the chain, visibly relieved to have paperwork forcing accountability onto someone else's desk for once. Debbie, cornered, tried to argue that board president complaints didn't require the same documentation as resident complaints. Article 9, read aloud by Priya at the next meeting, said otherwise, explicitly and unambiguously, stating all complaints, regardless of source, required a signed statement and supporting evidence to be considered valid grounds for enforcement action of any kind. Debbie's 38 complaints, none of them signed by any resident other than herself, none of them supported by evidence beyond her own written word, were suddenly, on paper, invalid. Every fine, every warning, every violation against 4 households legally void. The board, embarrassed and increasingly aware of legal exposure, voted to void all pending removal proceedings pending a full external audit of the complaint process. A motion Debbie fought bitterly but couldn't stop, her allies on the board thinning by the week. Debbie, cornered by the vote, tried one last maneuver at that meeting, suggesting the audit be conducted internally by a committee she'd personally appoint. A suggestion Priya, present as my legal observer, immediately objected to on the record as an obvious conflict of interest no reasonable board should accept. The board, visibly uncomfortable now under Priya's watchful presence, voted instead for an outside auditor selected by the Regional HOA Management Association. A small procedural victory that felt, at the time, almost too easy compared to everything it had taken to get there in the first place. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly, I felt exhausted. The particular exhaustion of having spent months proving a negative, that my dog hadn't done things he'd never done, while Debbie faced no consequence beyond a paused rule she could revive later. Carol told me privately that an audit alone wouldn't be enough. Debbie had survived audits before, she said, because audits looked at process, not motive, and Debbie was skilled at making malicious intent look like enthusiastic community stewardship on paper. What we needed, Carol said, wasn't proof that the rules were broken. We needed proof of why, a motive undeniable enough that even Debbie's most loyal defenders on the board couldn't explain it away as overzealous rule following anymore. That's when I remembered the Okafors, the family who'd left 3 years earlier, whose old house Debbie's husband had purchased below market value within a month of their departure. If that pattern existed once, it might exist again, and I was living proof of the second attempt. I checked my own property records and found something I'd never noticed. An unsolicited cash offer letter mailed to our house 8 months earlier, right around the time I'd questioned the landscaping contract, from a company called Voss Family Holdings LLC. I hadn't connected it before. At the time it seemed like ordinary junk mail, the kind every homeowner gets. Now, laid beside the timeline of fines and false reports, it read like the opening move of a much longer, quieter campaign to force us out. I told Danny about the offer letter that night, and he pulled our own mail records, confirming it had arrived exactly 9 days after the landscaping question at the annual meeting. Too precise a gap, he said, to be anything but a direct, calculated response to my one act of public defiance. We sat with that timeline a long while, tracing it backward. My question in the meeting, the offer letter 9 days later, the mulch note 2 weeks after that, and then the slow, steady drumbeat of fines that followed for the rest of the year, each one perfectly spaced to wear us down. Priya pulled the LLC's public filing records. Voss Family Holdings was registered to Richard Voss, Debbie's lawyer brother, with Debbie herself listed as a managing member, a detail she had never once disclosed during any board discussion of neighborhood property matters. A sitting HOA president, secretly co-owning an LLC that made lowball offers on homes of families she was simultaneously pressuring through fabricated violations, wasn't just an ethics violation. Depending on how it was framed, it edged toward something closer to organized harassment for personal profit. I didn't have proof yet that our specific harassment was tied directly to a purchase offer on our house. No letter had arrived for us the way one apparently had for the Okafors, but the coincidence of timing was too precise to be accidental. Marcus, listening to all this over coffee one Saturday, said quietly that his landlord had also mentioned a cash offer around the same time animal control showed up at his door. 3 separate targeted families. 3 separate unsolicited offers. Pattern was no longer a theory. We agreed not to confront Debbie yet. Instead, we started building a timeline document together: dates, offers, complaints, votes designed not for the HOA board, who'd proven too tangled in loyalty and fear to police themselves, but for people with actual authority. Priya suggested we needed one more piece. Direct evidence. Debbie herself understood the offers and the harassment were connected. Not just a strange coincidence a defense lawyer could later wave away as unrelated administrative overreach and separate business dealings. That piece arrived sooner than any of us expected. And from a source none of us saw coming, Debbie's own son, 19-year-old Brody, who worked weekends at the community clubhouse and had, turned out, a long list of resentments toward his mother. Brody found me one evening walking Biscuit near the mailbox cluster, hesitant, clearly working up the nerve to say something he'd been holding in for a while, glancing back toward his mother's house like he was afraid she could somehow hear him from there. He told me his mother had been talking on the phone about the Monroe house for months, using the word leverage the way other parents discussed grocery lists, and that he'd overheard her tell his uncle Richard the fines were just softening them up, softening us up. Water. This had never been about noise, or rules, or community standards. It had been, from the very first mulch letter, a calculated pressure campaign to make our lives miserable enough that we'd sell and leave. Brody said he'd stayed quiet for a long time because his mother controlled his car, his tuition, his phone plan, every lever a parent could hold over a 19-year-old. But watching Marcus's dog nearly get taken away had finally cracked something in him. He offered to give a statement, but only anonymously, terrified of what his mother would do if she learned he'd talked. I told him we'd protect his identity as long as we could, and thanked him, understanding better than ever how deep Debbie's control ran. With Brody's account, Carol's screenshots, the LLC filings, the false animal control report, and 3 families' worth of matching timelines, we finally had something that looked less like neighborhood gossip and more like a genuine pattern of coordinated harassment for financial gain. Priya said the strongest move wasn't a lawsuit, expensive, slow, and exactly the kind of fight Debbie's brother specialized in dragging out, but a formal complaint to the state's HOA regulatory body, paired with public exposure at the next general meeting. Debbie's power depends on nobody in this neighborhood believing they can beat her, Priya explained. The moment that illusion breaks in public, in front of everyone, her allies scatter, because none of them actually love her. They just fear looking foolish for trusting her. We started planning for the neighborhood's biggest annual event, the Pine Hollow Ridge Founders Gala, held every September in the clubhouse, the one night Debbie loved most, where she gave a speech every year celebrating the values that make our community exceptional. It was, we agreed, the perfect stage, not because we wanted spectacle for its own sake, but because it was the one night every resident, every board member, and crucially, the regional HOA management representative who oversaw disputes would all be in the same room. Carol warned me not to underestimate how far Debbie might go once she felt genuinely cornered rather than merely inconvenienced. I've watched her lose small fights before, Carol said. She's never once lost gracefully, and she's never once stopped at the first setback. I took the warning seriously, printing a second backup of every file, mailing a copy to Priya's office for safekeeping, and asking Marcus, only half joking, to keep an eye on our house whenever Danny and I were both away for more than a few hours. But Debbie wasn't finished escalating just because she sensed resistance. In late August, with the audit still pending and her removal rule technically voided, she found a new angle entirely, one that had nothing to do with paperwork or committee votes at all. She began appearing at neighborhood events with a large, muscular dog of her own, a mastiff named Duke, which she'd never owned before that summer, introducing him publicly as her emotional support animal, exempt, by her own rules wording, from every restriction she'd imposed on everyone else. I asked Greg, carefully, whether the board had ever required documentation for a claimed service or support animal before granting an exemption. He admitted the rule, as written, technically required it, but that no one, including him, had ever actually asked Debbie to produce anything for Duke. That gap felt deliberate rather than accidental. Debbie had written the exemption clause herself months earlier, vague enough to shield her own future pet from scrutiny while still airtight enough to find Marcus, whose paperwork, unlike hers, was still slowly working through an overburdened VA office. Duke barked loudly at nearly everything: mail carriers, children on bikes, the wind for far longer than 30 seconds at a time, in full view of the same neighbors she'd fined for lesser offenses, and no complaint against him ever appeared in the HOA's records. The hypocrisy was so blatant it almost felt like a taunt, like Debbie wanted us to see it, daring anyone to point out that the rules she enforced with such righteous fury simply didn't apply to her, the moment they became inconvenient to her own life. Marcus, still waiting on his official VA paperwork for his own companion animal, watched Duke bark uninterrupted at the mail carrier for a full 2 minutes one afternoon, timed it on his phone, and said nothing, saving the footage for later instead of confronting her directly. That patience paid off faster than expected. A neighbor 2 streets over, previously uninvolved in our informal coalition, filmed Duke barking at her own children through a fence and, unaware of the larger conflict, posted it casually in the neighborhood app asking if anyone knew whose dog this was. The post exploded with comments within hours, mostly from residents who'd never questioned Debbie publicly before, but had clearly been quietly annoyed by her rules for months, waiting for permission, in the form of someone else's courage, to finally say so themselves. Debbie deleted the post using her admin privileges within 20 minutes, but not before Carol had screenshotted the entire thread, comments and all, adding it to a growing archive that was starting to feel less like a defense file and more like an inevitability. Deleting the post backfired badly. Residents who'd seen it before it vanished began asking publicly why the HOA president could erase inconvenient community discussion at will, a question that had nothing to do with dogs anymore and everything to do with unchecked power. Debbie tried to control the narrative by posting an official statement claiming Duke was a certified service animal with documentation on file, though when a curious resident formally requested to see that documentation through Article 9's transparency clause, none ever materialized. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same maneuver she'd used against the rest of us, demanding paperwork from others while producing none herself. Except this time an entire neighborhood was watching, and an entire neighborhood was starting to notice the double standard. September arrived, and with it, the 30-day audit deadline the board had promised months earlier. Greg, the property manager, informed us the external auditor's preliminary findings would be presented at the Founders Gala itself, a coincidence of timing that felt almost too perfect to plan. Debbie, apparently unbothered, threw herself into gala preparations with theatrical enthusiasm, ordering a custom ice sculpture, hiring a string quartet, and telling anyone who'd listen that this year's gala would showcase how far our community has come under strong leadership. I found the irony almost unbearable. She was building her own coronation on the exact night the truth was scheduled to surface. Utterly convinced that charm, catering, and a well-lit clubhouse could outshine an auditor's report and a folder of documented lies. I started sleeping poorly that stretch of September, replaying every fine and every drive-by in my head, wondering how a dispute over a dog's occasional howling had somehow grown into offer letters, false police reports, and a car idling outside our house at midnight. Danny, more practical than me most days, said the exhaustion itself was proof we were doing something right, that Debbie only escalated against people who hadn't yet given up, and that giving up now, after everything documented, would mean 6 months of fear had been for nothing. 3 weeks before the gala, I got a call from Nadia, an old friend from veterinary volunteer work who now ran a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center 40 minutes outside town, specializing in orphaned and injured native animals awaiting safe release back into the wild. Nadia had been the one who first taught me, years ago, that most people's fear of wildlife came from unfamiliarity rather than actual danger. A lesson that would end up mattering far more than either of us expected once September finally arrived. I'd volunteered there years ago, long before Biscuit, long before Pine Hollow Ridge, helping bottle feed raccoon kits and clean enclosures on weekends, and Nadia and I had stayed close, the kind of friendship that survives on occasional calls and genuine mutual respect. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had a young skunk named Gizmo ready for release, fully decenteed at intake by a previous owner before surrendering him. Hand-raised, comfortable around people, harmless in the specific way most people wrongly assumed all skunks were dangerous. An idea started forming, not fully shaped yet, more instinct than plan. Something about Debbie's obsession with loud pets, ruining the pristine image of her precious common areas, and how little control that obsession would matter against something she couldn't find, couldn't threaten, couldn't out-argue. I didn't share the idea with anyone yet, not even Danny, because it felt reckless, almost childish, a fantasy of poetic justice rather than a serious plan. Until I remembered Debbie deleting that post, denying documentation, controlling every version of events she could touch. Sometimes the most honest response to someone who manipulates every official channel isn't another official channel. Sometimes it's simply letting reality, unscripted, uncontrollable, impossible to fine or silence, walk through the room and speak for itself, however unconventional that reality happens to look. I called Nadia back 2 days later and asked, carefully, whether a temporary, fully supervised, harmless release event was something her rehab center ever did as public education. Meet a native species demonstration, the kind wildlife centers host at fairs and schools all the time. She laughed and said yes. Actually, all the time, always leashed with a special harness, always supervised, always educational, always completely legal on private property with the owner's consent, which gave me an idea about exactly whose consent I might need to secure first. The Founders Gala was held in the Pine Hollow Clubhouse's great room, but the clubhouse also had a common area courtyard behind it, technically owned collectively by all HOA members, which meant, as a dues-paying homeowner, I had just as much right to that space as Debbie did. I checked the HOA bylaws myself this time, carefully, and found no rule prohibiting educational wildlife demonstrations on common property. No clause requiring board pre-approval for informational booths. Nothing at all that Debbie's own tangled web of regulations had thought to forbid. It was I realized with something close to disbelief. Entirely, technically, legally allowed, a licensed wildlife educator, invited by a dues-paying resident, presenting a harmless native animal in a common outdoor space. On the one night the whole neighborhood, board included, would already be gathered there. I spent an evening drafting a formal request to Greg, the property manager, framed innocuously as a community wildlife education booth for the gala's outdoor courtyard, attaching Nadia's rehab center's non-profit credentials and insurance documentation. Everything airtight, everything by the book. Greg approved it within a day, mostly relieved to approve something that wasn't another Debbie-related headache. And I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction realizing I just used the HOA's own bureaucracy, the exact weapon Debbie had wielded against me for months, for the first time in my favor. Danny, when I finally told him the plan, laughed so hard he had to sit down, then immediately asked if I'd lost my mind, then, slowly, started smiling the way he used to before all of this started. Like he could see the old neighborhood and the old me coming back. Priya thought it was brilliant, precisely because it was so unimpeachably legal. "You're not doing anything wrong," she said. "You're bringing an educational booth to a community event you have every right to attend. What happens after that is just nature." Carol, when I told her, went quiet for a long moment, then asked only one question. Could I make absolutely certain the timing lined up with the auditor's presentation? Because if the truth and the chaos landed in the same 15 minutes, Debbie would have no room left to recover. I called the county auditor's office, carefully, professionally, and confirmed the findings presentation was scheduled for 8:15 that evening, right after dinner service, right before Debbie's traditional closing remarks, the exact slot in the program where she expected to reclaim the spotlight and deliver her victory speech. Nadia agreed to arrive at 8 o'clock, set up quietly in the courtyard as planned, and I told her, honestly, that I didn't know exactly what would happen, only that I wanted Gizmo present, calm, visible, and completely legal, right as the evening reached its most public, most undeniable moment. In the final week before the gala, Debbie seemed almost frantic with preparation, cornering board members individually, rehearsing what Carol described as damage control language for the audit findings, clearly aware something was coming even if she didn't yet know its exact, unusual shape. She sent a neighborhood-wide email insisting the gala would focus on celebration, not controversy, a barely veiled instruction for the audit discussion, to be softened or skipped entirely, an instruction the regional HOA representative overseeing the audit, thankfully, had no obligation whatsoever to follow. Danny asked whether we should tell Deputy Alvarez about the plan in advance, just so law enforcement wasn't blindsided by a skunk appearing at a formal community event. I called him myself, and he laughed harder than I expected before promising, off the record, to make sure he was there. Alvarez said he'd been waiting a long time to see Debbie Voss face something she couldn't find, threaten, or delete, and that he intended to enjoy his evening off duty a great deal more than he usually enjoyed evenings spent responding to her complaints. Brody texted me 2 nights before the gala, still anonymous to everyone but me, warning that his mother had told Richard she was handling the Monroe situation personally that week. A phrase vague enough to worry me and specific enough to make me check every lock in the house twice. 2 nights before the gala, our home camera caught something new. A car I didn't recognize, Parked across the street for nearly 40 minutes after midnight. Engine off. No one exiting. Until it finally pulled away slowly. Deliberately. The way you'd leave a scene you didn't want remembered. I sent the footage to Deputy Alvarez immediately. He couldn't identify the plate from the grainy angle, but he logged the report formally, adding it to what he called, grimly, a very unusual file for a residential noise dispute that had somehow expanded into so much more. The next morning, I found our recycling bin knocked over and rifled through, papers scattered across the driveway, nothing valuable taken, nothing except, I realized with a chill, the shredded remains of an old bank statement I'd meant to destroy weeks earlier but hadn't gotten around to. It felt less like vandalism and more like reconnaissance. Someone searching for financial pressure points, confirming what an offer letter and a whispered phone call had already suggested, that Debbie, or someone working for her, was actively trying to learn how close we were to financial strain. Danny wanted to call the police immediately. I agreed, but Alvarez, when he arrived, gently reminded us that without a clear suspect on camera, there was little he could formally charge, though he added, quietly, that patterns like this rarely stayed invisible for long, and to keep documenting everything. That night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Danny and read through every piece of evidence we'd gathered since March. The fines, the false report, the LLC filings, Brody's messages, Carol's screenshots, and realized how far one woman's obsession with control had traveled. It had started with a note about mulch. It had grown into surveillance, false police reports, an attempted forced sale, and now, apparently, someone rifling through our trash at night. The scale of it, laid out fully for the first time, genuinely frightened me in a way the fines never had. Danny asked if I still wanted to go through with the gala plan, given everything escalating around us, or whether it was safer to simply let the audit speak for itself and stay quiet. I thought about it seriously, for the first time doubting whether poetic justice was worth the risk. But then I thought about Marcus's dog, about the Hendersons' empty driveway, about the Okafors who'd left years before any of us knew their story, about Brody's terrified voice near the mailboxes, and I understood something simple. Quiet had never once made Debbie stop. Only exposure would. I called Nadia one final time to confirm everything was still on for Saturday. She said Gizmo was calm, healthy, and ready, and reminded me gently that whatever happened in that courtyard, the animal himself deserved to be treated with care. Not spectacle, a reminder I promised to honor. Carol called the night before the gala, her voice tight with nerves, and asked if I thought we were doing the right thing, timing everything so precisely, letting a wildlife booth and an audit collide in the same 15 minutes. I told her I didn't know for certain, only that it was honest. Nobody's lying tonight, I told her. Nobody's fabricating a complaint or filing a false report. We're just letting true things happen in the same room at the same time, which is more than Debbie's ever let happen to any of us. Carol was quiet, then said simply, okay. Tomorrow, then. The morning of the gala, I woke up calmer than I expected, the particular calm that comes after months of low-grade dread finally reaching a fixed, unmovable date. Danny pressed my hand at breakfast and said, whatever happens tonight, we did this the right way, and I believed him. I dropped Biscuit at Marcus's house for the evening. Since dogs weren't allowed inside the clubhouse for the formal event, And Marcus, half joking, saluted me on the porch and said, "Give her hell, Rachel. Legally." On the record. At 6:30, Danny and I arrived at the clubhouse in our best clothes. The great room already glowing under string lights. The ice sculpture Debbie had ordered melting slowly near the dessert table. Guests mingling in a bright, oblivious hum of small talk and clinking glasses. Debbie stood near the entrance greeting guests personally. Radiant in a navy dress. Duke seated obediently at her side for once. The picture of a woman utterly certain she controlled every variable in the room. Unaware of the two variables walking through the courtyard door in 20 minutes. I made small talk. Forced myself to eat dinner. Watched the clock more than the conversation. And caught Carol's eye twice across the room. Both of us silently counting down the same minutes toward 8:15. When the auditor was scheduled to take the small stage near the fireplace. At 7:55, the regional HOA representative, a composed woman named Ms. Whitfield, stood and asked for the room's attention, explaining calmly that per the board's own request, she'd be presenting the findings of the recently completed compliance audit before the evening's closing remarks. Debbie's smile didn't waver. Not visibly, but her hand found Duke's leash and gripped it a little tighter, and I watched her scan the room quickly, almost reflexively, the way someone checks exits when they sense, for the first time, that they might actually need one.
And methodically, without drama, laying out the numbers first, 38 of 41 complaints filed by the sitting board president herself. 0 signed statements from actual residents. A documented pattern of enforcement targeting 4 specific households following disagreements at prior board meetings.
A murmur moved through the room. The particular sound of 100 private suspicions finally being confirmed in public. And I saw Debbie's carefully composed expression flicker for the first time all night. Her free hand rising slightly, as if to object, then dropping again.
And continued, calmly noting the false animal control report filed against the household that had provable evidence of being out of state at the time, the deleted community post, and the still unproduced documentation for Debbie's own exempted service animal, Duke.
Then Ms. to the section that made the room go truly silent. The property records, cross-referenced by the auditor's office, showing unsolicited purchase offers from an LLC called Voss Family Holdings sent to 3 of the 4 targeted households within weeks of their fines beginning. The audit, Ms. cannot determine intent, but it can determine pattern. And this pattern raises serious questions this board, and potentially outside regulatory bodies, will need to address. Debbie's face had gone pale, her jaw tight, Duke shifting nervously beneath her white-knuckled grip on his leash. Todd Reyes, sitting near the front, stared at his own hands, visibly unable to meet anyone's eyes. And I understood, watching him, that he'd known some version of this all along, that his sudden support for Debbie's compliance rules had never been agreement, only fear finally being priced correctly. Debbie stood abruptly, cutting into a pause in Ms. Whitfield's presentation, insisting loudly that the audit was incomplete, biased, and clearly the product of a personal vendetta from residents who've never respected proper community process. Her voice climbing toward the sharp register I recognized from every note she'd ever left me. Show me one shred of proof I ever profited from a single sale, Debbie snapped, scanning the room for allies and finding For the first time in 6 years, very few faces looking back with anything resembling loyalty. Mostly just the wary, calculating stillness of neighbors reevaluating everything they'd assumed about her. Danny gripped my hand under the table, and I felt the whole room's attention shift toward me before I'd even finished standing. The particular silence of 100 people realizing, all at once, that someone was finally about to say the thing everyone had privately suspected for months. My voice shook slightly at first, then steadied, the way it always did once I stopped worrying about how I sounded and simply focused on the facts in front of me. Facts I checked and rechecked so many times over the last 6 months that they no longer felt like accusations. Only truth. That was, unintentionally, the exact opening I'd been waiting for. I stood, calmly, and said I did, in fact, have documentation, copies of the LLC filings listing her as managing member, time-stamped alongside the fine schedule against my own household, and asked if the room wanted to see it displayed. Debbie's eyes found mine across the room, and for the first time in 6 months, I watched real fear replace the practiced irritation she usually aimed at me. A flicker of something almost like panic crossing a face that had spent years mastering the art of never looking rattled. "This is a private matter," she said, voice tightening. "And Rachel Monroe has had a personal grudge against me since the landscaping vote. An attempt to reframe 6 months of documented harassment as one bitter neighbor's petty campaign. An old, familiar trick starting to visibly fail in real time."
Unfazed, simply asked if I'd be willing to submit my documentation formally to the audit file, which I confirmed, and noted for the record that the auditor's office had already independently obtained the same LLC filings through public county records, unrelated to anything I'd personally provided.
That detail mattered enormously. It meant this wasn't one angry resident's version of events. It was independently verified, sitting in official county records for anyone to find, which meant Debbie's next move, whatever it was, would have to contend with facts that existed entirely outside her control. Debbie, cornered, pivoted sharply, gesturing at Duke and declaring loudly that this entire smear campaign had started because certain residents resented reasonable pet policies, insisting the neighborhood's quality of life depended on standards some people simply refused to respect or maintain. At almost exactly that moment, the courtyard doors behind the dessert table swung open, and Nadia stepped through calmly, professionally, in her rehab center's branded polo shirt, carrying a small harnessed animal against her chest. Exactly on schedule, exactly as planned, exactly at 8:15. A ripple of confused murmurs spread as guests near the doors noticed the black and white animal first, several stepping back instinctively before recognizing the calm, practiced way Nadia held him, and the laminated educational sign clipped to her booth table reading, "Meet Gizmo, rescued striped skunk. Fully decenteed." Debbie's reaction was immediate and total. She stumbled backward half a step, face draining of color, one hand flying to cover her mouth, as Duke, startled by her sudden movement, let out the loudest, longest bark anyone in that room had heard from him all evening. "Get that thing out of here."
Her composed HOA president voice cracking entirely into something raw and unpolished. The exact panic reaction of someone whose entire self-image depended on total control over her environment suddenly confronting something utterly, wonderfully outside her jurisdiction.
I stood, calmly, and explained. loudly enough for the whole room, and Ms. Whitfield to hear that I'd secured proper approval through Greg's office for an educational wildlife booth in the shared courtyard, fully compliant with HOA bylaws, fully legal, fully within my rights as a dues-paying homeowner. There's no rule against it, I said simply, watching the words land exactly the way I'd hoped. Because they were true. Because I'd checked. Because for 6 months Debbie had built an entire kingdom out of rules and I had simply, finally, found the one gap she'd never bothered to close. Nadia, ever the professional, calmly reassured the nearest guests that Gizmo was gentle, fully vaccinated, incapable of spraying, and perfectly safe, turning what could have been chaos into something closer to genuine curiosity as several children edged forward, delighted, wanting to see him up close. Debbie, meanwhile, had backed herself against the dessert table, Duke straining and barking at the unfamiliar scent. Guests laughing now, not cruelly, but with the particular relief of watching tension finally break, as the woman who'd spent 6 months finding families over 30 seconds of noise stood beside the loudest dog in the room. This is exactly the kind of noise disturbance I've been trying to protect this community from, Debbie shouted, gesturing wildly at Duke's barking as if the dog belonged to someone else entirely, a reflex so absurd, so blind to her own hypocrisy, that even Todd let out a startled laugh. Carol stood then, calm and clear, and asked simply, in front of the entire gathered room, whether Debbie's own animal, barking loudly, publicly, for well over the 30-second limit her own policy defined, would now be subject to the same fines she'd levied against 4 other households. The silence that followed felt different from every previous silence that evening. Not shocked, but almost gleeful. The collective silence of a room finally watching consequences catch up to someone who'd spent years believing consequences were only ever for other people. Debbie opened her mouth to answer and found, for what may have been the first time in 6 years of HOA leadership, absolutely nothing convincing to say. Standing frozen between a barking dog she couldn't control and a room full of neighbors who no longer believed a word she said.
Ever composed, used the pause to formally announce that given tonight's developments, the State HOA Regulatory Office would be opening a full investigation into potential misuse of position for personal financial gain, effective immediately, separate from and in addition to the completed compliance audit.
Board President Deborah Voss, she continued, reading from a prepared statement I hadn't known existed until that exact moment, is hereby suspended from all HOA duties, pending the outcome of that investigation, per Article 14 of the Association's governing bylaws regarding conflicts of interest. The room erupted into overlapping conversation, guests turning to each other in open disbelief, and I watched Debbie's face cycle through disbelief, fury, and something close to genuine panic as she realized, in real time, that the kingdom she'd built was collapsing in front of every neighbor she'd ever intimidated. "You can't do this," Debbie said, voice shaking now, no longer aimed at any single person but at the room itself. Ms. Whitfield, at the auditor's report, at the skunk still calmly nestled against Nadia's arm, as if even the universe had turned against her specifically. Someone near the dessert table laughed, not unkindly, and a few others followed, the sound spreading through the room like a small release valve finally opening after months of pressure most of them hadn't even realized they'd been carrying alongside the rest of us. Debbie spun toward the sound, furious, demanding to know what was funny, And the laughter only grew, because there was nothing left for her to threaten in that moment. No fine to levy, no letter to send, no complaint to file against a room simply reacting honestly for once. Todd, finally finding his voice after months of silent compliance, stood and said quietly but clearly that he'd like to formally withdraw his prior votes, supporting the compliance escrow and removal proceedings, stating for the record he'd felt pressured to support measures he'd never actually believed were fair. 2 more residents I barely knew stood after Todd, admitting quietly that they'd also felt uneasy voting alongside Debbie for years but had assumed, wrongly, that they were alone in their discomfort, that everyone else genuinely supported her, when in fact almost no one had. Privately, that was, perhaps, the truest twist of the entire evening. Not the LLC, not the false reports, not even the skunk, but the simple, quiet realization spreading through the room that fear had been doing far more work to keep Debbie in power than actual loyalty ever had. Debbie tried one final gambit, turning toward her brother Richard, seated near the back, silently urging him with her eyes to intervene, to threaten legal action, to do whatever he'd always done to make problems like this disappear before they cost her anything real. Richard, to his credit or simply his own self-preservation, stayed seated, his expression carefully blank, clearly recalculating his own exposure now that his sister's LLC filings were part of a formal state investigation, unwilling to attach his own name publicly to whatever came next. Watching her own brother refuse to move seemed to break something in Debbie more completely than anything Ms. Whitfield had said. Of the clubhouse. Duke straining at his leash. Guests parting slightly around her the way a crowd parts around something suddenly unfamiliar. Marcus, who'd slipped in quietly near the back once, he'd learned Biscuit was settled at his place, walked forward and, gently but firmly, said what none of the rest of us had quite dared to say directly to her face all evening. "You did this to yourself, Debbie." She looked at him, then at Carol, then at me, searching, I think, for someone who might still defend her out of habit or fear, and found no one, the entire room having quietly, collectively decided in the last 20 minutes that the spell she'd held over them was finally broken. Gizmo, entirely unbothered by the human drama unfolding around him, shifted comfortably in Nadia's arms and let out a small, curious chirp toward the dessert table, and somehow that tiny, ordinary sound of an actual harmless animal broke the tension into something close to laughter. Even Debbie, in the strangest possible moment, seemed to notice the absurdity of it. A woman who'd fought for 6 months against 30 seconds of dog noise, now undone in front of her entire community by an animal that hadn't made a single disruptive sound all evening.
But firmly asked Debbie to surrender her board keys and access credentials on the spot. Standard procedure during a suspension. And I watched Debbie's hands shake as she unclipped the small ring of clubhouse keys she carried, visibly, proudly, for 6 years.
The clubhouse fell almost reverently quiet as Debbie unclipped each key one by one. The small metallic clicks, the only sound in a room that, 20 minutes earlier, had been full of polite small talk about caterers and centerpieces and nothing at all like the truth. I didn't feel joy watching her hands shake. I felt something quieter, steadier, the simple, hard-won relief of watching 6 months of documented patience finally outweigh 6 years of unchecked power, in front of every single neighbor who needed to see it happen with their own eyes. As she handed them over, Her composure finally cracked completely, tears mixing with fury as she muttered something about ungrateful neighbors and everything I've done for this community. A version of events I don't think she fully believed herself anymore, even as she said it. Danny squeezed my hand under the table, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for most of the last 20 minutes, my heart pounding not with triumph exactly, but with the strange, heavy relief of watching something true finally outweigh something false in front of everyone who mattered. I hadn't wanted spectacle for its own sake. I'd wanted an ending that couldn't be argued away later, revised in someone's retelling, softened into misunderstanding over time, and standing there watching Debbie's own hypocrisy expose itself louder than any accusation I could have made. I finally had it. Carol found me afterward, eyes wet, and hugged me tightly, saying only, "Thank you for finishing what the rest of us were too scared to start." A sentence that landed heavier than any thank you I'd received in months, because I understood exactly how long she'd carried that fear. Marcus told me later that Deputy Alvarez, present that night off duty as a guest, had quietly informed him the false animal control report alone was likely enough for a formal harassment referral, separate from whatever the state investigation into the LLC eventually concluded. Debbie left the clubhouse before dessert was served, Duke still barking as he was led to her car, Richard trailing a few steps behind her, and I watched from the window as the woman who'd spent 6 months trying to force us out drove away from a room full of people done fearing her. The gala continued, oddly, warmly, the string quartet still playing, guests slowly returning to conversation and cake. The ice sculpture nearly melted into an unrecognizable shape, and Nadia, laughing softly, told me Gizmo had thoroughly enjoyed his brief, historic career as a symbol of overdue justice. Nadia packed up her small booth an hour later. Gizmo settled and drowsy in his carrier, and told me before she left that she'd never expected a rescued skunk to end up at the center of a neighborhood scandal, but that she was glad he'd gotten to do something good. I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot, the September air finally cool after a long, humid summer, and felt, for the first time in 6 months, like I could breathe all the way out without waiting for the next letter to arrive in our mailbox. The following week moved fast. The State Regulatory Office formally opened its investigation into Voss Family Holdings, and Greg, newly emboldened, forwarded every complaint file, every deleted post screenshot, and every fine record Carol and I had compiled directly to their office without waiting for board approval. The board, now missing its president and 2 of its most loyal votes, called an emergency session to appoint an interim leader, and to my genuine surprise, 3 separate residents nominated Carol, who accepted, visibly nervous but clearly relieved to finally lead openly instead of quietly resisting from the sidelines. Todd resigned from the board entirely rather than face further scrutiny over his prior votes, a decision most residents seemed to view as reasonable rather than cowardly, given how publicly he'd already tried to make amends the night of the gala in front of everyone. Marcus's VA paperwork finally cleared 2 weeks later, formally certifying his companion animal, a certification that, under Carol's new leadership, the board immediately and unanimously agreed carried full protection under existing law. Without a single objection or delay this time, I filed my full harassment log, including the county animal control officer's supporting statement, formally with the state investigators, and Priya told me the LLC's unsolicited offer pattern alone, combined with the fine timeline, gave the case a strength she rarely saw in HOA disputes this early on. Brody reached out one final time, no longer anonymous, thanking me quietly for handling things carefully enough that he'd never had to publicly testify against his own mother, though he admitted he'd moved out that week regardless, staying temporarily with a friend from his community college classes. I told him I understood completely that none of this had ever been about hurting him, and that I hoped, eventually, some version of his relationship with his mother could heal, separate from whatever consequences she now faced for choices that were entirely, exclusively her own to answer for. The Hendersons, hearing what had happened, reached out to see if it was too late to bring their beagle back from their cousin's house. And Carol, in one of her first official acts as interim president, personally assured them the compliance escrow and removal rules were being formally repealed. Debbie's suspension became permanent removal from the board within a month. Following a unanimous vote, even Richard, present as a guest rather than her advocate, offered no objection, his own legal exposure apparently matching more to him now than his sister's wounded pride. Waiting those 4 months tested my patience more than I expected. Twice I called Priya just to ask if the silence meant the case had stalled, and twice she reminded me, patiently, that thorough investigations into financial misconduct simply took time neighborhood gossip never had to wait for. Debbie, in the meantime, stayed largely out of sight, no longer attending community events, her name mentioned mostly in passing, the way people talk about weather from a storm that's already moved on but left everyone still cleaning up afterward. The state investigation, when it concluded nearly 4 months later, found sufficient evidence of pattern harassment connected to attempted below-market property acquisition, resulting in a formal censure, a substantial fine, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board within the state going forward. I heard, secondhand through Carol, that Debbie and her husband quietly listed their own beige colonial for sale not long after, the flag out front finally taken down for good, and moved to a town 2 counties over where, as far as any of us knew, no one had ever heard her name. I felt, when I heard that, less triumph than I expected, and more a kind of tired clarity, the specific exhaustion of having spent 6 months proving something true against someone who'd spent 6 years making an entire neighborhood believe truth didn't matter as much as her comfort did. Carol, settling into her new role, proposed a full rewrite of the HOA's noise and pet policies at the next general meeting, restoring reasonable, clearly defined standards, removing the vague, excessive vocalization language entirely, and adding a formal, transparent complaint process requiring signed resident statements going forward. The proposal passed unanimously, the first unanimous vote Pine Hollow Ridge had seen in years, and afterward several neighbors who'd never spoken to me directly during the whole ordeal came up simply to say thank you, admitting quietly they'd been too afraid to speak up themselves. Marcus's dog, finally, formally protected, walked the neighborhood freely again, and the Hendersons' beagle came home 2 weeks later to a small, spontaneous welcome-back gathering near the mailbox cluster, the same spot where my own 6-month ordeal had technically begun with a note about mulch. Biscuit, blissfully unaware of the 6 months of chaos his occasional howling had somehow set in motion, greeted the returning beagle with the enthusiastic, uncomplicated joy only dogs seem capable of, and for the first time in a long while, Larkspur Lane simply sounded like a normal, imperfect neighborhood again. Nadia released Gizmo back into a protected wildlife corridor 2 weeks after the gala, sending me a photo of him disappearing calmly into the underbrush, and told me, laughing, that he'd unknowingly done more for community accountability in one evening than most HOA meetings managed in a decade. Priya, refusing any payment beyond a home-cooked dinner, told me the case had reminded her why she'd wanted to practice law in the first place, and admitted she'd already started quietly advising Carol's new board on properly rewritten bylaws designed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse from happening again. Danny and I hosted a small backyard cookout that October. Nothing formal, just neighbors who'd become something closer to friends through 6 strange months of shared frustration. Carol and Marcus and the Hendersons and even Todd, awkwardly but genuinely trying to make things right with everyone he'd let down. Standing in my own backyard that afternoon, watching Biscuit chase the Hendersons' beagle across grass that finally belonged to an ordinary, unremarkable neighborhood again, I thought about how strange it was that the thing that finally broke Debbie's grip wasn't outrage, or lawyers, or even the audit. It was simply the truth, allowed to walk freely, exactly like everything else here finally could. In the months that followed, I found myself thinking less about Debbie and more about how easily fear had let one person's grievance masquerade as community standards for years, and how much quieter courage, Carol's, Marcus's, Brody's, even Todd's eventual honesty, had been needed to finally undo it.